Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwen Faulconer Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwoods, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with award-winning author and historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. Here now on Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the names we learn? John J. Dwyer, what's this story?
Gwen, today we get to exercise one of the greatest rights of history buffs, and a practice that we try to follow as often as possible in our Oklahomans history books, in all of our history books, and in all of our work at the Red River Institute of History. We get to peek into the inner sanctuary of momentous Oklahoma history through the eyes of the people who made it. The two people we explore today are two of the greatest women that Oklahoma has ever produced. And in this case, Gwen, there's an added bonus. We're going to do it through the very words of one of those heroes, Clara Luper, the legendary mother of the modern American civil rights movement. In fact, that very accurate description of Clara Luper is in itself a hallmark of what we do in our work at the Oklahoma-based Red River Institute. We find the real history of our state and nation, the true heroes and their feats, and we share them as we're doing right now with you, dear listener, and thank you for listening. For there is so very much of our history that has been forgotten, overlooked, ignored by the national court historians on the coasts and elsewhere, and sometimes buried by we ourselves. As you well know, Gwen, we've devoted another entire Oklahoma Gold program to the life and deeds of Hoffman, Oklahoma native Clara Luper. Among many memorable remembrances, she was arrested 26 times for her intrepid labors to bring African Americans in Oklahoma the many rights they were promised by the United States Constitution, but were not receiving. But who is the other woman of this drama? Well, she's Della Duncan Brown, one of the greatest philanthropists in the history of the state, though that was largely anonymous in her time, in no small part because of the terrifying kidnapping threats against her and her children that tormented them in that earlier generation when that particular crime was much more often attempted against the wealthy than in the 21st century. Della Brown also led the iconic Oklahoma City-based John A. Brown department store chain for nearly 30 years. You listeners who have lived longer lives may remember how Brown's and Brown Duncan department stores in OKC, Tulsa, Norman, and elsewhere coupled imagination, innovation, customer service, and daring to grow into one of the largest employers in Oklahoma and one of the great commercial dynasties of the Southwest. Meanwhile, Clara Luper and the Oklahoma City NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, their youth council's historic 1958 sit-in opened up Katz Drug Store lunch counters in Oklahoma City and elsewhere to African Americans. Oklahoma high school teacher Luper then turned her focus to the OKC-based John A. Brown department store chain. She was determined that blacks be allowed to sit at Brown's lunch counters. Also, that they could try on the shoes and clothes they were allowed to purchase but not check for size, that is, put up against or wrap around their skin. For 4 years, from 1957 to 61, Clara Luper and other blacks, as well as whites, picketed and protested, always nonviolently, out front of the main downtown store and conducted sit-ins at the John A. Brown's lunch counter. All the while, Luper tried without success to connect by phone with the widowed company owner, Della Duncan Brown. Then Brown responded, but an angry Luper at this point ignored her for weeks while continuing to protest. Finally, after many of Luper's own best friends, family members, trusted counselors, and even NAACP youth admonished her that she should lay aside her own anger and pride and meet with Brown, she did so. By the way, we get these stories from Clara Luper herself in her book, Behold the Walls. It's from that work, in Clara Luper's own words, that we shall look back at one of the most remarkable friendships in Oklahoma history.
Friendships?
Friendships. Didn't start out that way. And from here on, Gwen, I'm going to be speaking not the words of John Dwyer, but the words of the great Clara Luper from her own book. And here we go on Clara Luper's words. I was ready for Mrs. John A. Brown. All of the frustrations building within me for the last 4 years were going to come out right in her white face. When the secretary opened the door, I walked into an office. I was overcome with history because that office was Mr. John A. Brown's former office. The furniture, the pictures, the papers, and in spite of the improvements and refurnishings that had happened at John A. Brown's, that office was just as it was when Mr. Brown died years before. This was a woman who was clearly still very much in love with her husband. My frustrations began to diminish, and when Mrs. Brown opened the door, we both stood speechless before each other. And with tears in our eyes, we embraced each other as if we had been friends for years. Oh, I know this couldn't be, but it was. And now we were talking. Two women, one black and one white, one rich and one poor. Historical circumstances had brought us together, Clara Luper continued in her book, Behold the Walls. We talked about our families and some of the problems we had faced as we both tried to compete in a man's business world. We both cried again as I told her how I had tried to make it, how I was working on 3 jobs trying to educate my children and to provide them with the necessities of life. She told me about her husband and how he had died. We talked about how much we had loved and how much we had lost. And Gwen will get into the nitty-gritty of that historic visit between civil rights icon Clara Luper and OKC business titan Della Duncan Brown after the break.
But I understand you had to search far and wide to find Mrs. Brown's first name?
That's right. As those that maybe have explored similarly, Mrs. John A. Brown was well known in some historical accounts. But to find Della Duncan Brown took some doing.
And they became friends.
They became friends. And those that maybe missed out on the earlier part of this show, Clara Luper and the NAACP Youth Council and other blacks and whites, including no less than Charlton Heston, El Cid, and Ben-Hur himself, who famously came and carried a picket. They had protested for 4 years outside of John A. Brown and could not even get a phone call in response from Mrs. John A. Brown to Clara Luper's entreaties.
If I may, we'll continue on when Clara met Della when we come back. This is Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories we cherish. When Clara met Della. John J. Dwyer, tell us more.
Gwen, before the break, we were recounting in Oklahoma civil rights icon Clara Luper's own words from her book, Behold the Walls, her memorable first meeting in 1961 with Della Duncan Brown, the brilliant owner and leader of Oklahoma's renowned John A. Brown department store chain. 2 brilliant, bold, and scarred women from the same city, Oklahoma City, but from different worlds. Angry African-American Luper. And she had tried for years to get the Brown stores to integrate their lunch counters and allow blacks, it's hard for us to believe this now, right, to try on the same clothes they were purchasing.
They were not allowed to try on clothes.
We can only assume it's because, well, it would brush against their skin.
Yes.
So praise God, we've come a long way, but we don't sugarcoat the past either. Meanwhile, lonely, uncertain white captain of Oklahoma Commercial Enterprise, Della Brown, long hamstrung from doing so, from integrating her own store's lunch counters and allowing blacks to try on the clothes they were purchasing. Hamstrung from doing so by human and historic forces in that time, not ours looking back judgmentally, but in that time that were apparently beyond any one individual's capability to adjust. Brave presidents hadn't been able to do it, Congress people. And yet here they were, Clara Luper and Della Brown in Brown's office, learning to their mutual shock just how much they had in common. And now I'll continue and conclude this program, as before, in Clara Luper's own words from her book, Behold the Walls. Finally, Clara Luper wrote, Della Brown said, I have been told that you hate me. Is that true? I said, no, Mrs. Brown, I do not hate you. I respect you. You have challenged the male-oriented business world. You shall always have my respect. I have been told that you hated me, I said. Oh, no, Clara. I've heard that, but it is not true. I admire your courage. I have stood here and have wondered day in and day out what you and your children were saying about me. Clara, tell me, please tell me what the children think about me. What do they say, Clara? As I looked at her, Luper's words, I knew that I had to tell her the truth. Her penetrating eyes stared directly into mine. Mrs. Brown, they say that they wish you had died in place of Mr. Brown. They said if he were living, they believe they would be able to eat here. For a few minutes, there was complete silence, and then she spoke. Clara, day in and day out, I have worried about this thing. I just don't know how to deal with it. You see, Mr. Frank Wade has leased space in my store to operate the luncheonette, and under his lease, he has the sole right to run it in his own way. You see, my hands have been completely tied. Yes, Mrs. Brown, Clara responded, but we don't know anything about Frank Wade. But John A. Brown's, that's different. This is the store where we have spent our money, and we can't see how we can be discriminated against under the roof of a Brown store. We talked for nearly an hour, and again, the words of Clara Luper from her book, Behold the Walls. Mr. Anderson came in and brought us some lemonade. He offered her the first glass, and she said, serve Clara first. Finally, she said, take this message back to the children. Segregation will end at John A. Brown's. I was so proud of her. She admitted to me that the first time I was arrested, she called and offered to pay my bond. She never missed calling to see if I were all right, she said. She asked me to come and meet with the executives of John A. Brown and tell them why we selected their store. I followed her to a spacious conference room where I told my story. When I left that day, I had a lifetime friend in Mrs. John A. Brown. An agreement was made that day that Brown's segregation walls would fall. In less than a week, blacks were eating there. Mrs. Brown and I continued to talk by telephone. She invited me to go to Europe with her. I turned it down because of her other commitments. Before she went into the hospital for the last time, she called and told me that she was going in under a different name and she would probably never see me again. She wanted me to know that she appreciated what we had done for this city, for Oklahoma City, a city that she loved so well. Mrs. John A. Brown acquainted me with loneliness in a way that I had never known it before. When she died, I couldn't control my emotions. I went to her funeral and followed the procession to her final resting place. A white executive of the store said, I am glad you came. She was my friend. I loved her, and I had to come.
The power of a conversation. Now that's Oklahoma Gold.